Hi everyone. Today's video covers advanced practical dynamics of both the anima and the animus, taken from a recent dialectic between Steve and Pauline Richards and a brilliant IPSA student in a recent professional training seminar. The anima in men and the animus in women direct an individual's relating to their lifespan development, biopsychosocially, but they have crucial differences in their anticipations and their dynamics due to the evolutionary history of the species in the Paleolithic. In the first part of this video, the student asks about the power of the animus. He raises a powerful performance by Andrew Harwood Mills as Lord Brionne, in this context the archetypal animus, acted from the script to Steve and Pauline's Jungian mythos, Victrix, and asks about how it, that is the animus, has the ability to direct a woman's fate. Steve and Pauline respond in full, giving highly practical answers derived from their 40 years of clinical experience each on how the anima and the animus work in life and relationships, and how, if someone is seeking individuation, it is absolutely crucial to be as conscious as possible of any and all projections of the anima and the animus onto other people. The alternative is unconsciousness, and indicative of the person having much more to learn about their identity, their personal myth, and their instincts. Let's go.
I've met Steve and Pauline for the first time on Friday,
Yes.
and the rest of me, well, we'll get to know each other soon, I guess.
Great, brilliant.
Regarding the animus, I have accumulated a lot of content with that because I was so interested in that, because it took a big role in my own life in the last year. And I guess I would like to start off with the first light remark and then question. In your video on YouTube, this is how the full power of the animus. You mentioned that the animus is controlling her, the woman's environment, and her fate. So in that regard, I would like to know if one can imagine that the animus is even superimposing on other parts of the psyche, and also if it is more related to an instinct or if it's more related to an archetype. So I guess what I would like to know is if the animus is, or if it has the power to even cover and conceal basic elements of the unconscious psyche, so that these concealed elements won't work anymore properly.
Do you want to start or shall I?
Well, it has its roots in instinct. I mean, we tend not to use the concept of archetype particularly.
Yeah, but just in the context of that video, it was close. The presentation was very close to Jungian theory,
right.
Orthodox Jungian theory.
True.
And
yes.
We can operate in that way, no problem. We would internally not do so, but for the purposes of rapport with someone or for communicating theory, we can do, because of our experience obviously is in that. So we can model it that way. And again, in the context, which is obviously important, the presentation, it was Andrew.
Oh, yes.
Andrew's, he was speaking words from a film script, and he did embody the animus so well that that video has had such effect on women, hasn't it? You
don't look at me like that.
Yeah, go on. You take over from here.
Well, I might not be able to now. You've said
I wrote the words, but I didn't speak them, and that's a joke that we have, because I don't know if you know about that. Barry Manilow, he wrote a song called "I Write the Songs," but I don't sing them in this case because I need an actor to voice them, to give them that power. But I know what they are. And Andrew's a great actor. He's a fantastic guy and a dear family friend. But he has to have the right script to perform, doesn't he?
He does, yeah.
And he did have the right script. So was you to the point of view of
You've got me thinking about his performance now, which means that's yeah.
Because that is archetypal in the Jungian sense, in that collapsed Jungian sense.
Yes.
And it was written to be and to have that manifestation and that effect. But the relationship between instinct and archetype, in that sense, that the archetype, we would say, is the representation of deeper structure things, and the script is a narrative to bring all of those into relationship with one another, isn't it?
Yeah,
I'm
thinking about his performance now. This is the problem with these things, isn't it? Yeah. Yes, well, you as you say, Steve, you wrote the words. He's animated the words. He's brought the words to life, but they have to be the right words and said and done in the right way. So had you not written them as you had, somebody else had written them, they may not have had any impact at all. So it's not just about the delivery of them, is it? No, really, no. To be fair. Well,
well, the reason I was able to do that was obviously because of my experience working with women, but also working on myself. And then having that connection then to how this thing that we could say is the animus constellates in the world, and then the impact that has upon women. So I knew how to distill it as part of the narrative of a story of a relationship. And in that sense, he played it out really well. It's as if he said himself that he went into an altered state of consciousness. He wasn't hypnotized, he accessed it. So he's accessing an understanding within himself of what it would be to be that thing, that force which would interact with a woman's psyche in that way. And then he was able to access it, wasn't he? So you could say that there is what the Jungians call an archetype because it presents in that way, but behind it there's an instinct and also a genome and a narrative, and again superposition with one another, and it flows through. But from the perspective of a woman, Paul, if you can please organize yourself sufficiently to answer the question.
Do you know, it is, if I don't think about it, I'm all right, but the minute I think about it, that's it, all is lost, because of the power of it, like you say, the force of it, the numinosity of it is such that it has the power, as I think you're suggesting, Frank, to push other dynamics, psychological dynamics, out of the way, and to inflate the ego to such an extent that it would be possible for it to direct a woman's fate in the way that you described. Because I mean, you see this with women where they get behind a cause of some kind, and the famous one that tends to be trotted out in Jungian circles, it's a bit hackneyed now really, and it's the one that Marie-Louise von Franz refers to in Man and His Symbols, is Joan of Arc, for example. But it's anything really that in terms of an ideology seizes a woman sufficiently that it becomes an all-consuming force or cause to get behind. So it could be anything really. It could be, you know, an attachment to some kind of environmental or ecological cause. It could be feminism per se. It could be lots of things. But when it seizes a woman in that way, it has such a strength to it, such a numinosity to it, that it has a kind of what the Jungians would call sacred conviction. In other words, it's something that is so identified with by the psyche of the woman that it isn't challenged in any way. And so, to all intents and purposes, it is running the show at that point. The inflation is such that it is directing that woman's psychology and her behavior and any consequences thereof.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers it sufficiently, by all means come back and, you know, ask away.
Yes, to clarify maybe a little bit more, so the numinosity that you mentioned, Pauline, is it because of the personal material that is accrued on this nucleus? Is it because of that? And would the animus lose part of its numinosity when the personal material, let's say through therapy, is lowered in its valence, and hence maybe possible to integrate the nucleus of the animus into the self-concept?
I think what has to happen is that obviously when the animus is identified with in that way, and the ego is in effect inflated by its contents, it's because it's an ego identified complex potentially at that point, but with all the power and the numinosity of instinct or of the archetype behind it. So whether reaching the point that you just described in therapy would only be possible if it was possible to get that particular woman to disidentify with the content. And I think sometimes that can be easier said than done. It probably depends to some extent on the strength of the ideas as to whether it's possible to get that particular woman to separate from them sufficiently to integrate them. That tends to be very context specific. It's probably the same with the anima in that regard.
The animus has got its, as it's classically presented,
yes,
it's got its specifics though.
Yes, it has.
It's female psychology,
it
isn't
is.
it? And that's the thing, it
It
gets
is.
projected sometimes onto men, but if we want to understand women, we have to understand the animus.
We do.
But not as masculine. It's a feature of a female psychology.
Yeah, it is.
It's partly the preparedness to relate to men, but also more widely to relate to their lifespan. And including power relationships. Status, hierarchy, all of that, that's all involved with the animus, isn't it?
It's all involved with it, and as you say, Steve, it has unique characteristics, observable characteristics in that regard, and one of them is this idea of the connection to the power of the word, whether it's in, you know, whatever form it's in. It could be in written form, oral form, whatever, but words, it seems, for women have a particular attraction, and if there is power attached to those ideas in some form as well, then they tend to be particularly attractive. And you know, we could argue probably as to where that comes from. We tend to personally be of the view that it's likely, in an evolutionary sense, Paleolithic, because back then it would have been the men in any particular social group or tribe who would maybe warn families or you know, the social group at large with respect to any concerns to do with safety, for example. And so you know, you can imagine that would, particularly in back in those times, because obviously they were very dangerous and sort of precarious times in which to live, that if a warning was given about a particularly dangerous or potentially dangerous situation, that would be taken seriously. So you get into the idea of you know, the word and the power of the word, and it coming from men, maybe male elders in a group, as being of great importance to the group, and because it's coming from men and not from women as well, you've got that, you know, sort of the fact that it's differently toned, it's oppositely sexed. All of that tends to give a kind of a power and authority to the idea of the word, and in particular probably the spoken word. So it's probably got its roots there, and then has, you know, persisted over time. And you know, we then get into ideas about things like culturally, like the patriarchy and so on, you know, as to whether that exists or not. You know, that idea that feminists certainly buy into, that men have all the power and all the status and all the influence and all of that, and therefore what they say tends to have power and authority attached to it. So you can see where that might come from. Genomically, you know, psychologically, psychosocially, there are various, you know, inputs to it, but it is it's definitely characteristic of female psychology, and the way that women model what it means to be masculine.
There seems to be a preparedness to seek it out.
There does,
so that
yes.
the seeking system in women seems to look for it, to be represented in men, or to seize it for themselves.
Yes.
And that is probably where the idea about a patriarchy comes from. But in a primitive, highly competitive, dangerous environment, it would be likely that it would be the men who would protect the borders.
Yes.
It would do the hunting for the big animals, would fight other men. And therefore the word and power and concepts like law, all of that's going to be associated with masculine so-called things. But, you know, I'm not sure if we're answering you actually.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I would like to get some, you know, some dialogue about it, because I have to form these concepts first all together, and it's okay. I have read.
I would just add to that it would appear that it has nothing to do with the way that men really are, or the way that men really present. And I think it's important to say that. Otherwise, you know, again, it's as if, you know, women make men responsible for all kinds of things for which they are not responsible, and therein lies the problem of the animus, when things go wrong and when it becomes pathologized. So I think, if nothing else, we need to locate the problem, if I can call it that, of the animus firmly and squarely in the psyche of women, and kind of leave it there, really.
As the anima also,
yes,
if you understand the anima, you understand men, not women.
That's right.
And if you understand the animus,
yes,
you don't understand men, you understand women.
You understand women. Yeah.
Just to add to that a little, it doesn't have really anything to do with what we have discussed so far, but I have read a book a couple of years ago from Murray Stein.
Oh yeah.
For me, it's been an introduction into the ideas of Jung, really. And he mentions that the anima and the animus, that they are the via regis, so the king's way to the self. I don't know what you think about that, because to me, in a way, it seems like a bit of pop psychology, but on the same token, as I have my own experience at the moment with this overamped animus thing that somehow has taken a huge place in my life, I consider it to be not only pop psychology, but the really the very obstacle to overcome. Well, obviously it's not my obstacle, but it's the obstacle of my ex-girlfriend. But in a way, it seems to be the central thing that has to be addressed in a way. And I posted something earlier that day in the morning in Discord, in the Carter 5 channel, and that's tightly related to that. So maybe I can bring it up here a little bit, if I have that little bit more space. And it's the idea that if we consider that the via regis is a real thing, and it's a king's way to develop yourself in a way which is organic and which brings you to the thing that you always wanted, even though you have never really known that you wanted it. If we consider that to be a real thing, that this kind of development takes time, it doesn't happen overnight. And in my experience, there has always been like a delaying effect. So having an intense experience, and then there has always been like a paradigm shift. Either it was that this ex-girlfriend of mine and me have broken up, which was the most recent thing, or we have not seen each other for a long time, which has been before we were together, or we had a big fight when we were friends 15 years ago, so I've known her for a long time already. And this developmental step has always been recognized only after a certain time, when this new paradigm has been in place, let's say. So it always seemed that there had to be some almost evolutionarily slow time frame to actually let this a development take place in a way. I had the same happening with me, especially with my relating. But as we were talking about the animals at the moment, and I would like to get into that. If you have some thoughts on the Kingsway idea, which leads to the development that you always wanted to have, and especially if this development can be more or less witnessed by the libido that you feel in certain delaying timeframes.
Thank you. There's a huge amount in there. If we follow a Jungian path, then that's absolutely indicated. What you say is absolutely right. If we follow a Jungian path, and I say that as being someone, and Pauline with me, we've shared that path, and all of it then appears to be absolutely necessary and sufficient. You have to do it. That's how it can appear to be. And if you do, then you'll reach that conclusion. You'll reach the conclusion that's indicated by the path. So I guess that you're probably seeing then that I'm suggesting it's not always necessary to follow that path. So I do not believe personally, for what that's worth, anymore, that it is necessary and sufficient to do it in that way. Now, what I would do and what I have done is to get away from the Jungian interpretation of these things is to look at people broadly and see what they do in the everyday sense of things, and then to move that up a register and look at how the culture represents relationships between men and women through films, novels, whatever it might be, and then try to distill out the fundamentals of that process, and then add another layer, which would be biology and an evolutionary perspective. And from those three, something distills out, in my experience, which is different to the very heavily inclined towards mythopoetic explanations that you get with Jungians. And at the same time, the Jungian material is heavily suggestive and inductive. It's almost trance-like. Yeah. And that's a problem for me now, personally, at my point in life and with my own personal experience. And if I measure myself against the people I've worked with who have issues of relating, there's a huge gap between the Jungian model and them. And I had to find a solution for that. I had to work out what the heck was going on. Where these apparent Jungian fantasies were coming from and projections were coming from onto people to make it appear as if it were that way. And one of the ways that I worked out for myself was to be creative and generate in a specific way, not in a formulaic way, novels and screenplays that would illustrate this, and then see if the unconscious, as Jungians would understand it, would agree with that way of representing these internal dynamics. And it appeared that it did. But what I got from that was the abstraction of such things away from individual circumstances. So at best, a good novel or a good screenplay will give us a general background impression, a little bit like a dream, that's unanalyzed or collapsed into the life of an individual. So it's a collective representation. and therefore not specific. And yet what therapy does demand is that we apply a specific to the lived context of a person's life, whoever that might be, with all of the different possibilities that are present within it. So when it came to that particular actor and the scenes that he was reading from and that story behind that, we had a very complicated character which suddenly moves it away from collapsed Jungian states. He is a representation of the animus, but how he gets to be where he is explains why he's in that state, and therefore why he's experienced by the women in the way that he is. And that adds another dimension, which is not a collapse into the woman's understanding of the man, but the man himself and how he got to be like that. And that's a reality orientation, which means that in everyday life, when we relate to others, and then there might be anima animus projections going on, we are robbing the other of their context if we do not understand them or make an attempt to understand how they got to be where they are. And in that particular story, he's such an exaggerated character because his negative anima, or actually the collective negative anima, has weaponized him and shaped him and basically stripped him of his own soul and left him a husk yearning for completion. And the negative anima in the story, in the form of a goddess, has to be a goddess, of course, to have that power, did so in order to target a specific family because of the story that's behind it. So he presents perfectly weaponized and in a state of loss of soul himself. So he will then draw the compensation from the other, the specific woman that he's been shaped to target. But he has to not be able to feel that. He only has to know what his own feelings are urging him to do. So he's at once vulnerable and extremely powerful, mesmerizing but distant. All the things that will draw a woman to try to complete the picture of the animus that she has inside of herself, but at the same time ignoring the reality of the man and how he has been shaped that way and made a weapon by another woman. The other woman, being a goddess, nevertheless understands the target, which is this human woman, and what would be necessary to break into her life and to capture her at the level of her soul. So she weaponizes this man as a version of the animus and sends him off, and he becomes extremely effective at doing that, and it's tragic at the same time. So if we then bring that into relationship to everyday life, each of us has a perspective and a journey, and we've been shaped by our events, and then we turn up and make an impression on another person. And when the real person is not known, and this is pure Jungianism, obviously, where the real person is not known, there is a tendency to project. And that's what happened with the victim of this animus, this crafted animus, was she projected according to her own vulnerabilities and deep instinctive need. She projected that which becomes the Jungian representation of the animus archetype onto this man, who has been eviscerated of his own identity and soul and believes fully that he needs this woman to complete himself. So he's in a state of vulnerability and has been aimed at this other woman in order to draw out the strongest possible projection or transference. But that requires both of those parties to not know the other and to not know themselves.
Just an unconscious relationship.
It's an unconscious, completely unconscious. And that has to resolve down to the level of the genome. It must come from there in an undifferentiated, instinctive, meta-instinctive form, which resolves into what Jungians call an archetype and is then projected in an attempt to heal the whole situation. But in everyday life, we do this when we meet people, and we don't get to know them properly because we don't know ourselves. Therefore, we don't know what is projected. And then the relationship is magical and extremely vulnerable.
Yes.
And in order to continue the relationship, very often people have to accommodate the projection or the transference from the other party and act as if they are that thing, and therefore sacrifice their own identity. And they will feel a loss of soul on the inside themselves, and then they might have a reciprocal projection or transference onto the other, and the relationship is truly Jungian in that abstracted sense at that point, because the reality element is missing and it appears to be elevated and magical.
So could one say if one was to sum it up, that there were too many collective factors in it and too little personal factors then?
Too little personal factors, and those personal factors that are operating are those which are problematical for the person concerned. So at a mundane, everyday level, we could say that in that screenplay, the woman had everything apparently on the surface that she could want in terms of materialism. She's attracted to shiny things. Nice person, but the attachment from an extroverted, she was an ENFP in effect, extroverted intuition, and then a subjective sense of feeling value towards the objects, the glittery things, meant there was a disconnect with her core nature. I would say instincts rather than archetypes at that point. And then the purely instinctive man, who is somehow magical and not like the other alpha men who could have attempted to woo her or move her out of her relationship or her marriage. This man was a man of mystery. This man had deep wisdom. His eyes, he had the 1,000-mile stare, and he was empty on the inside, but he was so focused on understanding at that deep level what her needs were, which she herself was unconscious of, that necessarily drew out the attachment to him. But he had to be made a victim to be effective by the negative anima. It's really
wow.
Controlling him. So he then could be completely genuine and yet hollow. That means he's not a psychopath. That's the difference. And he's not predatory. He doesn't intend to be. He has the best of intentions, but his soul has been taken from him, and he's been convinced by the negative anima, you must have this woman, and you will not be complete until you do. But you get a version of that occurring in relationships in the real world. And that's what I mean. The value of that kind of representation, that mythic one, is that it gives us a perspective on the totality that is possible. But we must resolve that. We must collapse that down and say, what's going on for me right now? If we operate at the level of the transpersonal, of the so-called archetypal, we are never relating at all. It's not happening.
Yes.
But there might be an attachment based on the need to overcome the projection, which is a form of homeostasis. Like, I know that there's a projection and it's mutual, but I need to solve this. And then there's this conflict, and that ends up with people coming together, coming apart, coming together, coming apart. Because there is mutual unconsciousness, but at the same time, there's a kind of inflation that comes from the collective, which you could call archetypal or instinctive. It's certainly unconscious.
Wow. I would have to add a whole lot of things to that too, but I don't want to capture the stage for me.
Well,
so
what I can say, if you don't mind, is that the way that you come across, and I've only met you twice, is that you're very articulate, you're intelligent, you have an energy about you which is masculine without a doubt, and you put all of that together, then that is a formula to draw projections of the animus from women. And if you, I know you have experienced this, obviously, I would predict that if you hadn't, you will get that. And so understanding the animus, which you seem to want to do, if you can do that, then you'll understand the relationship that women have towards you. But you have to understand the anima to know why you're in the state that you are in, or how, or you're not in a bad state by any means, but why you constellate a particular form of relationship from women to you. And that would be your task. And I would say that in a mythological sense, that would make you like the guy in the script. That your connection to your own anima, if you can find that, will heal you. And then your relationship then to women will alter according to your relationship to yourself on the inside, which is similar to what you were asking of Pauline before, that if the woman has a conscious relationship to her animus, then it will, the whole thing will readjust. Oh, yeah. But if not, it's necessarily projected. And very often men will attempt to understand the animus in a woman without realizing that's what they're doing, but at the same time actually overamp their own representation of the animus because they are trying to understand it in the woman. The woman will think, this is wonderful, all this attention, it's going right into my very soul, the bit of me I don't know, this man somehow knows, when really he's trying to understand himself as well through the relationship to the woman. And then the reverse equation occurs. and it's as if the woman can somehow solve the man's problem and the relatedness on the inside. So the level of unconsciousness then is mutual, and it creates a field relationship where it's elevated, but at the same time in conflict.
I mean, it's what we think of in ordinary terms as being the infatuation stage of any relationship, or in alchemical terms we get into things like the conjunctione as well. And as you say, Steve, at that point the relationship is effectively an unconscious one, and the capacity of the people involved to withdraw projections is tested, and you know, this is where it's difficult really, because you're moving into this kind of field where we place so much emphasis on becoming conscious and on withdrawing projections. If you're in a relationship where, you know, you're carrying projections for somebody else and they're not able to work through that consciously themselves, it can become a bit of a problem. But you know, ultimately people can go on like in that state for a very long time before things become difficult. And you know, John Destian of Coming Together, Coming Apart fame says that obviously men and women do this because ultimately in the act of projection we're trying to find out who we truly are. So and you can see how that is the case. But essentially the infatuation stage or the animation stage of any relationship is one of mutual unconsciousness. And it's also the seedbed in which parental complexes are laid down as well. And then if you move through the alchemical stages, I'm not suggesting we do that now, but if we just say move on to something like the calcinatio, which follows on from the infatuation stage, where people start to relate to one another in a very sort of fixed and systematized way, then that's when parental complexes become reinforced. And that's why also the relationship starts to become difficult, or people start to see that they have the capacity to hurt one another, which they didn't observe during the infatuation stage. Because what happens is that similarities between people, shared interests, shared values, whatever, tend to be dialed up in the infatuation stage. But as they move beyond that and they get into the calcinatio and things become more fixed and more predictable, you find that the fluidity that was present in the infatuation starts to disappear, and they actually start to relate to one another unconsciously through parental complexes, and they don't understand why then they start to be disapproving of one another, or start to feel resentful, or want to withdraw from one another, and all of those kinds of issues start to manifest in the relationship. So it's a challenge, isn't it? It's a challenge for anyone in a long-term relationship, or whatever the nature of that relationship is, to address some of these things. And some people do it more readily than others. And if you're in a relationship with somebody where you're seeking to become more conscious of yourself and they're not, that potentially is a problem, unless you can bring that person with you on the journey. And help them to understand what's going on, in which case that tends to then be a very positive change in the way that couple relate to one another.
Yeah, that's a danger in therapists actually, who may be in a relationship with someone who doesn't share the journey, and then if they get into a Jungian kind of extended relationship to a patient, suddenly the patient's more interesting than their partner, or the husband, wife, whoever it might be, because this person is warming to you, is projecting all sorts of things, and is changing because of what you're doing with them psychologically. And then all the alchemical fantasies constellate around that then, and then it does become a closed vessel, and it excludes the marriage or relationship partner of the therapist, and then the affairs occur, as has happened with most of the first generation Jungians. And they justify,
and they exploit it,
because they exploit it, and they say it's alchemy, and it is of a kind But it's because they've become more unconscious. As they go into that alchemical process, they follow it as a formula, literally an alchemical formula. And they think, I'm now in this stage and the next is that. And they're not actually relating. And they seal their fate because they go through those processes by anticipating them and then generating them, and they seal their own fate. You see that happening a lot.
Yeah.
It sounds like these first generation Jungians then would have set themselves up to be part of some kind of experiment then.
Yeah.
Where they knew what was the outcome. So they just follow the protocol. And I can see how this is not relating at all, because they had some hidden agenda in the back of their minds.
Yeah.
And they just wanted to, I don't know, they probably had some kind of, well, I don't know, but maybe to me it seems that there was some kind of vessel that was taking a grip on them, and they had some kind of pride maybe, where they thought that they might have known more than the other, and it's pretty much a power dynamic. Is it like in that direction?
Yes, well, it's the young, I think what you're describing very well is the Jungian inflation, that they know things that the patient, the other person doesn't know. And then, of course, Adler steps in, and the power drive. And then you've got Freud behind that for the self-gratification. So, you know, all three of those elements are present in that situation. And you know, the outcome obviously is it's not very nice. And arguably shouldn't go on in these circles. But if we don't put a spotlight on it, it will continue to go on, and it does continue to go on, unfortunately.
It does. They've no excuse, unfortunately.
No, they haven't.
There's no get out of jail card on that.
None at all.
They should know better.
They should know better, yes, and they do. And that makes it even worse in a way, that they do know better, but they still proceed with it.
I would say in therapy, it's very rare you need to go into that kind of depth with anyone. Very, very rare, if it's therapy. Therapy, in our view, is that there's a problem and you work to solve it with someone. You help them until they don't need your help. But personal development is different, but you need to have distance. If not, then you are right into the mix yourself and you get dissolved.
Yes, you do.
You know, and so that's our view, isn't it, about the way boundaries should be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks so much for answering that.
We really hope that you enjoyed the first part of that dialectic. In the second part, the student asks about the relationship between the animus and depression. Steve and Pauline consider this question in full, drawing on their own clinical case studies and experience to explore how depression can influence the anima and animus, and reciprocally how the anima and animus can influence a state of depression. Crucial attention is drawn to the powerful suggestive element innate to Jungian ideas, and how one should be very, very careful not to passively identify with, or clinically suggest to others about, any of the mythological constructs around the anima and animus. At core, both of them are the relating function, and not an inner man or woman with their own independent sentience. Steve and Pauline then explain the Jungian concept of the so-called loss of soul, a very common fallout from breakups, for example, from a biological and instinctive standpoint, why it exists, what its intentionality is with respect to communicating from the genome to the ego, and how someone can work through such events in their life.
I have one more quote from Murray Stein.
Yeah, sure.
And it has to do with animus and depression. I will paraphrase it because I've read it in German, so I quoted it in German here on my note. Anima and animus are ever active in the psychic life. Their presence belong to the determination of determination whether there is depression or not. It's beyond the sexuality of the body, but also it deals with the sexuality of the psyche. So the last part is not so important for me. The first part, which in a way deals with, in a way, the animus being a determinant for having a depression or not. Do you have any thoughts on that, how that might occur in a way?
Well, a couple. Just let's start.
Yes,
Paul?
okay.
Yeah. Relating is the thing which is external relating, certainly is the thing which is damaged by depression initially. So the relating functional system is compromised in males, females, or whatever self-identity a person has about their gender or biological sex. So in that sense, relating is compromised by depression. So that's obvious. That's the first one. The second one I would say is that the power of suggestion with Jungian ideas is enormous.
Yeah.
And if you were to say to a woman or communicate the idea that the animus exists, you could induce depression simply by talking about it.
Yeah, you could.
Because when it's described as a death demon, and it often is by Jungians, and Jungian women analysts do this, as if it will seize a woman's soul and take her life away. If you suggest that, or if the theory suggests it, you could then bring about depression simply through suggestion. Yeah. So that's dangerous. Did you want to add to that, Paul?
Just quickly, yes. I don't know if you're familiar with Women Who Run With the Walls, the book Women Who Run With the Walls by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. But in that book, she specifically describes the animus, the negative animus, that is, as being a derisive, murderous antagonist that's born into women. And, you know, that's just to follow on really from what Steve said about the suggestive power of those words are such that it would tip anybody into depression, quite frankly, excuse the pun. You know, if that woman then relates to herself in that way, as if she's got some kind of inner oppressor, that is filtering every thought, every idea that she has about herself with respect to her self-concept, you could see how ultimately that would certainly lead someone, a woman, down a very dark path indeed. And it all depends the extent to which you buy into that. If you buy into the suggestion that that is true, then, you know, you're going to end up in a very dark place. And she kind of, I guess, pulls back a little bit from that in other parts of the book, where she talks about then having to accommodate the concept of the negative animus in some way, as you know, allowing it to exist, if you like, as an idea inside a woman's mind, in such a way that it has the freedom to kind of, I think the expression she uses it is, if you were to sort of, what are these prisons that they have now? You know, open prisons. So you kind of, it's as if the animus then, the negative animus, is a kind of an open prisoner. So he's kind of free to roam a little bit. You kind of allow him a little bit of license. Even I'm falling into the trap of reifying it by saying, hey, this is the problem with it. But if we're talking specifically in a Jungian way and using Jungian concepts, this is what happens. But that's how she gets around the notion of the negative animus not being too destructive in that sense. But it, like I say, it's implicit in the way that he's described that the animus is a he is a real thing. He is a real entity that's born into women, and it's simply not the case. Me as a woman, as personally, I no longer buy into that, because I think it's so dangerous. I really do.
I'd agree. There's two cases I usually quote, which are very old, which is why I quote them, well over 30 years old, where I got rid of clinical depression in two women, one of whom had it for 30 years at that time, and this is more than 30 years ago, and she was on major tranquilizers. It had affected her so she couldn't speak properly, she was drooling, she had brain fog. And then another woman who a psychiatrist said don't use hypnosis with, but the GP said, yes, please try it. In both of those cases, the animus was never mentioned.
No.
In one woman, the solution came through asking her psyche to give her a dream. That was the first one, the woman who's heavily medicated. and we got her off all the medication. And the other one, we did use hypnosis, and it got rid of it quickly. The animus was not touched. In the hypnosis case, it was simply visualizing sunlight as a child. Her eyes closed, but as a child, feeling the light coming through her eyes and the warmth of the sun, and memory from childhood. That did it. That got rid of, literally just eliminated her depression and got her out of psychiatry. And the first one, I suggested that her unconscious, if it agreed, would give her a dream that would then be something she could tell me about, and then we would be able to move forward. And in that dream, she said that I painted the inside of my house white, everything, the windows, the floor, everything. And then I opened the door, and it was nighttime, and outside a white car came for me, and I got in the car and drove away. And that gave me the confidence to say, you will get well. And on that basis, we got her off all of the medication and returned her to what she would have been, minus 30 years of that medication. But in neither case was the animus discussed or talked about. Yeah. So in that classical sense, it was of no relevance. Yeah. And if I talked to either of them about the animus, they probably would have both killed themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly if it had been in that way, the kind of descriptions
the
that
demon way,
yes, yeah, you know. Yeah.
So we have to be careful with Jungian ideas. We really do. They can be dangerous.
Or even as an inner predator as well. I mean, that's another one you've got to be careful. Yeah. It is, yeah.
And the animus described as a death demon by Jungians very often.
Yeah.
And that's a terrible thing to suggest. Yeah. A man then will not want to relate to women, which will cause depression, because he will stop relating. Yeah. He'll be in fear of this inner representation of the outer woman, and that will kill him. That's an awful suggestion.
Yeah. Well, that's similar with respect to the animus, and again, I think it's Marie-Louise von Franz who comments on it in Man and His Symbols, where she talks about the the dark stranger, and the way that women connect to that idea as a fantasy, and then they end up not being able to relate to real men at all. Because they're caught in the fantasy idea, the intrigue, the mystery of the idea, and they become captivated by it in the same way that we see young men every day captivated by fantasies about the anima, and then stop relating. They do in real terms.
And if you push dreams from people, and then you, as a therapist, if you highlight an image and then you amplify, which Jungians love to do, amplify images by association to collective representations, then the next dream will parody you and appear to agree. And then the Jungians are off then. And some poor guy who just had a random dream representing an instinctive scenario that should have not even been remembered probably, has been taken out from the living tissue of his mind and populated with the therapist's collective fantasies, reinserted, and now we have a problem that didn't exist before the therapist made that suggestion. And that goes on all the time with them.
So if we take, let's say, therapy out of the equation and just look at real world phenomena in relating. So I'd like to know, I guess, so I was in a relationship with my ex-girlfriend, and we broke up more than a year ago, a little more than a year ago, and I suffered from that greatly until a few weeks ago, and I was pretty sad, really sad, and also really depressed. And I talked to James, and I consulted James because I couldn't cope with the pain anymore. And excuse me, it's actually, so James mentioned that there the relating, it was there, it was in the world, in my case as a male, and suddenly the female to which I have related was not there anymore. So it was like it popped back in rapidly into myself, into my unconscious, I guess, I don't know. I would like to know about these psychodynamics, if it's the same in women, or if it's different because also the relating to the nurturing first parent is different. So first of all, I would like to know if this is some kind of difference between male relating and female relating, and basically also this would be like the follow-up question: where exactly does it go? Where exactly does the relating go if it's not there suddenly?
Well, I would say that both men and women experience a loss of soul. We've actually had this conversation, Steve, haven't we, too? And it's part of the problem with Jungian theory, in so much as the Jungians tend not to talk about women having souls. They talk about the animus and spirit, but not soul, which is a kind of a nonsense, really. But I would say that at the end of any relationship, you know, regardless of how unconscious or conscious that relationship was, that both men and women will experience a loss of soul, because whatever projections were taking place in the relationship, whatever animation was arising as a result of the relationship, is suddenly no longer there in terms of having an object to relate to or to project onto. So I would say it's the same for men and women in that regard.
Yeah, at that level of analysis, description and explanation,
yes.
If we use a Jungian term.
Well, that's it, isn't it? Yeah.
But there's another perspective you could take, which is more biological, but not reductive into biology, but simply includes it. And a psychological way into that is, first of all, to consider how that affects our self-concept. That if a primary adult relationship is missing suddenly because it's ended, that leaves a gap in terms of the genomic intentionality for us to complete our lifespan development of adaptation. And because that gap's there, we're going to feel instinctive pressure to fill it. But we will first feel that as a sense of loss, which, if we can interpret that, is an impetus to overcome the loss. And the depression occurs when we don't feel the impetus to overcome it, but rather to indulge it, which means that the ego collapses around the affect which approaches it from within to say there has been a loss. We collapse around that. But if the affect says differently, and it's more seeking system to say, well, there is now room in my life to continue my development, either with that person again in the future or with someone else, then I will go and I will adapt. And the person who thinks that way will feel better, because their instincts will align behind them, because no instinct wants you to destroy yourself unless it's Thanatos. And that's a very special case. And there are only special conditions under which I think that's valid to follow Thanatos. I think there are times when it is, but not over that. Over that, we should move forward and not collapse into ourselves. Because what we will find when we collapse in then is the impetus to compensate against it. And that first comes up negatively. In other words, once we move into depression because of the loss of a relationship, the images and the feelings that hit us are unpleasant, because it's meant to be so unpleasant that we don't indulge in it. That we say, this is so bad in here now, I don't want to know, I'm going to go out. And then the bad representation that we felt literally through affect has served its compensatory purpose. But if we feel it and then we indulge it, that is not compensation. That's the wrong choice, and it's an ego choice. It's a failure by the ego to adapt to a signal that says, wouldn't it be so awful if you didn't engage with life? This is how it will feel. And if the ego says, oh yeah, it does feel that way, oh no, that's not the right way to interpret it, go out.
Yeah.
And that's when people can become depressed.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an instinctive assessment of a situation, and then a sense of loss from your self-concept of self-esteem. We have to interpret that positively. Otherwise, it's inevitable that we won't interpret it positively because of the strength of affect that's trying to say, this is so bad, you don't really want to feel this way, do you? So go out and contradict it. If we say, no, I don't want to go out. I like being so bad in my feelings and feeling sorry for myself. What will happen is the compensation will push harder.
Yes.
Like, I mean, this isn't unpleasant enough for you. I'll make it feel worse. How does that feel? It's even worse. Great, I love it. You know, in effect, we're saying, I want to feel depressed, and the person disappears into a singularity within themselves. But that's contrary to biology. Biology would not want you to feel that way. So it's the adaptation of the ego that's wrong at that point.
I think the problem is that Jungian psychology encourages that dissent.
It does.
It gives, you know, it values that dissent, that darkness, that you know, journey into depression as being somehow profound and meaningful, and that you have to go through that in order to come out the other side. Like there's no other way of dealing with that other than going in. And you know, again, the suggestive power of that is huge, massive, and harmful at the same time. And the other thing that I think is the problem with Jungian theory is that they have a tendency to reduce relating to just the biological aspect of relating and not relating more broadly as well. And you know, that can be a way of healing from a relationship as well that's, you know, ended, in so much as we're back to creativity as well, aren't we? You know, you can relate to so many different things in life, including your creativity, and that is generative. That, you know, again, your instincts will get behind that, and it may also lead to situations where the forming of new relationships is more likely, because, like you say, Steve, you build your self-concept, you do positive things to change your own energy in the way that you come across, and so that you're more likely to bring other people into your life if you do that.
Relating generates relating.
It does, yes,
whereas
it does.
depression generates avoidance.
Yeah.
So it makes no biological sense to be depressed.
No.
In that ordinary sense, but there are conditions under which it is valuable. A conservation withdrawal makes sense biologically. If you're completely overwhelmed by life, sometimes you have to be shut down from within, because the ego is not adapting properly anyway, and will end up destroying the whole organism. So a withdrawal of libido from relating to outer life as a conservation withdrawal is healthy under certain conditions. And another issue where depression can be important, if you have a good relationship and you lose it because of bereavement or something like that, then depression is understandable, because there has been a loss of something which was supportive and valuable to you. So you can feel that. But the ego has to evaluate, was this a good relationship or not? That's the job of the ego. And if it misunderstands a bad relationship as being a good one, it can go into an inappropriate form of bereavement for the loss of that relationship, and then stay there and not come out of it. So we can look at depression in a number of different ways, over relationships and the ending of them.
I think the point you make about conservation withdrawal is an interesting one, Steve, because arguably, while it's a withdrawal of libido, it might, to all intents and purposes, be perceived as depression. Because you tend to get a kind of a lowering of consciousness or an abasement of consciousness with it. It's not really depression per se. And I used the term convalescence earlier, and I think that if people allow themselves, it's an old-fashioned word, I know, but there's dignity in it. The idea of really just marshalling or remarshalling your energy, so that you can then decide how you want to apportion that energy in the real world is a very helpful one. And it's only ever meant to be transient anyway. Convalescence is meant to be transient. No, it isn't. It's a time in which you build resources. But the idea of just flat out depression is just such a negative. That I'm not saying it should be dispensed with, but you know what I mean. I think we have to be careful about how we conceive of it, really.
And there are people who are depressogenic. They bring about depression in others there are internet gurus like that who are peddling depression as being the right way to live, and that's obviously wrong.
Yeah.
And also people who are depressed tend to want everybody else's energy around them to be lowered. They pull energy out from other people.
They do.
You know, it's a black hole. It really is.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to quickly say that was incredible. I just wanted to add that as well. Really helped me out. No, thank you.
Yeah, he brought some
Oh,
great,
yes.
well thought
Yes.
out and lived ideas,
Yeah.
you know, and experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
The thing it highlighted for me is, and it's not as if we haven't sort of visited this before, but the trapping nature of so many young ideas, really, if we're not careful.
Yeah.
It really highlighted that for me.
Yeah.